Maybe you have been praying for so long that the silence now hurts more than the waiting. Maybe you still lift your hands in worship, still whisper the right words, still tell people that you trust God. But somewhere deep inside, something has grown tired. Not dead, not gone, just tired, tired of hoping, tired of trying to interpret closed doors, tired of watching other people step into their breakthrough while your life feels like a hallway with no handle, no window, handle, no clear handle. And what makes it harder is not just the delay, it is the meaning you have attached to the delay. Because when heaven stays quiet for too long, the human heart begins to write explanations God never spoke. You start wondering if you missed something, if you failed somewhere, if maybe you were not as called as you thought, if maybe God moved on while you were still begging him to stay. But what if the silence is not saying what you think it is saying? What if the season that feels hidden is not empty at all? What if the place where nothing seems to be moving is actually the place where God is forming something in you that public breakthrough could never build on its own? That is why the story of Elisha matters so much. Because Elisha is not just a prophet with miracles attached to his name. He's a living answer to a deeper question. What does God do in a life that stays close to him long enough? What happens when someone keeps saying yes in hidden seasons, ordinary seasons, inconvenient seasons, grief-filled seasons, misunderstood seasons? What kind of life is built when a person chooses obedience before they see outcomes? And perhaps the most unsettling part of Elisha's story is not what happened through his hands while he was alive. It is what happened after he died. His body had been buried. His voice had gone silent. His ministry, to human eyes, was over. And then one hurried day, in the panic of a burial interrupted by raiders, a dead man was thrown into Elisha's tomb. The moment that body touched Elisha's bones, life returned. The dead man stood up. Breath rushed back into him. A life that had already been declared over opened its eyes again in the darkness of a grave. That is not a normal ending. That is a divine statement. And before we get to the bones, we have to go back to the field. Because God often begins his deepest stories in places nobody is watching. Elisha's story did not begin in a palace. It did not begin on a stage. It did not begin with applause or prophecy conferences or public recognition. It began in dirt, in repetition, in ordinary labor. He was behind oxen, working a field, living a life that was familiar and understandable. There is something almost sacred about that beginning, because it reminds you that God is not intimidated by the ordinary rhythm of your life. You may think the hidden season disqualifies you. God often uses it to introduce you. Elisha was plowing when Elijah came near him. No announcement, no build-up, no spectacle, just a mantle placed across his shoulders for a moment. A touch, a symbol, a silent interruption from heaven. And sometimes that is how calling comes. Not with noise, but with weight, not with explanation, but with invitation. Elisha understood enough in that moment to know his life could not remain the same. He ran after Elijah. He asked to go say goodbye to his parents. He returned home, but not to negotiate with his calling. He returned to cut off retreat. He slaughtered the oxen. He burned the plow. He used the tools of his old life to fuel the fire that marked the end of that season. That matters because many people want a calling without a burning plow. Many people want a mantle while still preserving a clean path back to comfort. But there are moments when obedience becomes real, only when return becomes impossible. And maybe that is where some of you are right now. You keep asking God for clarity. But maybe part of the ache you feel is that he already showed you enough to take the next step. Not the whole map, just enough for obedience. And you are waiting for a level of certainty God never promised before surrender. Elisha did not receive the whole story that day. He received a direction, and that is often how God works. He does not always give you a blueprint. He gives you a next. Yes, so Elisha followed Elijah, not as a star, not as a sensation, as a servant. That part is easy to skip over because we like dramatic moments. We like mantles falling, rivers parting, fire from heaven. But before any of that, there were years of walking behind another man. Years of learning, years of watching, years of staying near, years where Elisha was not yet publicly powerful, but privately formed. And that hidden formation is where many people lose heart, because we want destiny to look immediate. But God is often less interested in making you visible than in making you ready. There is a painful mercy in that, because the very thing you call delay may be the kindness of God, refusing to place weight on a version of you that cannot carry it yet. You call it slowness, he calls it strengthening. You call it silence, he may call it depth. And this is where the story starts pressing on your life. Because some of you are exhausted not because God is absent, but because you have been reading preparation as punishment. You have been calling the hidden season rejection. You have been calling the ordinary season neglect. You have been calling the long road a closed heaven. But the hidden season is often where God builds the inner life that can survive the visible one. Then came the day that changed everything. Elijah knew he was nearing the end of his earthly journey. The atmosphere around them shifted. They moved from place to place. And at each stop, Elijah told Elisha to stay behind. Stay here. The Lord has sent me on. It happened again and again. Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, the Jordan. And every time Elisha refused. That refusal was not stubbornness. It was discernment. He understood that something holy was unfolding, and he would not step away just because the road was emotionally difficult. He would not trade proximity for comfort. That says something powerful to anyone in a hard season. Sometimes the breakthrough is not in doing something dramatic. Sometimes it is in refusing to leave, refusing to stop praying, refusing to let grief become distance, refusing to walk away from God because you do not understand what He is doing, refusing to confuse emotional pain with divine abandonment. At Bethel, the sons of the prophets whispered that Elijah would be taken. Elisha answered them with restraint. Yes, I know, be quiet. There are moments when grief is too sacred to explain, too holy to discuss casually, too raw to make public before God has finished what He is doing. Some of you have tried to over-explain your pain while still standing inside it, and that can deepen the ache. Not every season is meant to be narrated while it is happening. Some seasons are meant to be carried quietly with God until the meaning becomes clearer. Finally, Elijah and Elisha came to the Jordan. Elijah took his mantle, struck the water, and the river opened. They crossed over on dry ground. Then Elijah turned to Elisha and asked the question that opened the future. What may I do for you before I am taken from you? Elisha could have asked for influence, position, safety, recognition, but he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. That request was not ambition in the shallow sense. It was weight awareness. He knew the road ahead would be costly. He was not asking to look powerful. He was asking to be able to carry what God was placing before him. That is a very different kind of desire, and maybe that is a prayer some of us need to recover. Not God, make this easy, but God, make me ready. Not remove every hard thing, but give me what I need to remain faithful in what you have called me to. Then heaven interrupted history. A chariot of fire and horses of fire separated Elijah from Elisha's throng. A whirlwind took Elijah upward, flame, glory, movement. Awe, and Elisha cried out like a son losing a father and like a servant, watching heaven mark a transfer he could never control. Then silence returned, but something had been left behind. The mantle, the same mantle that once brushed his shoulders in a field now lay at his feet with new weight on it. Elisha tore his garments in grief, picked up the mantle, and walked back toward the Jordan. This is one of the most important moments in the entire story, because sooner or later, everyone who walks with God must face the question Elisha faced at that riverbank. Will you trust the God of yesterday in the place where yesterday is gone? Elijah was gone. The familiar voice was gone. The mentor was gone. The visible source of strength was gone. And Elisha stood there with a mantle and a river, and one question in his mouth. Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? That question was not unbelief. It was transition faith. It was the cry of someone standing between what used to be and what had not fully begun yet. If you have ever lost something that once made God feel familiar, then you know that place. The relationship ended. The job disappeared. The door closed. The person who prayed with you is no longer beside you. The season you knew how to navigate is over, and now you are standing at your own Jordan asking, God, where are you now? Elisha struck the water, and the river opened, not because Elijah was still there, not because grief had ended, not because everything felt clear, but because the God behind the mantle had not changed. Please hear that what sustained you was never merely the season. It was never merely the person. It was never merely the structure. It was never merely the visible sign. It was God, and God can still make way in the season after the season you trusted is gone. When Elisha crossed back over, the sons of the prophets saw it and recognized that the spirit that had rested on Elijah now rested on Elisha. But recognition from others was not the center of the moment. The center was this. God had confirmed his presence in the middle of painful transition. And some of you need that truth badly, because transition feels like loss before it feels like movement. And if you read every transition as punishment, you will miss the mercy inside it. Then Jericho came with its wounded water. The city looked well placed, but its source was damaged. The water brought harm. The land suffered because the spring itself was bitter. Elisha asked for a new bowl filled with salt. He went to the source, cast the salt in, and declared the Lord's healing over it. The waters were healed. Think about how precise that miracle is. He did not decorate the city. He did not comfort people around the problem. He went to the source, and that is how God often works in us. We beg him to fix symptoms while he aims at the spring. We ask him to remove stress while he exposes what bitterness has done to our inner world. We ask him to change the atmosphere while he touches the source of fear, shame, unbelief, or disappointment. We ask him to make life easier while he heals the well we keep drawing from. That can feel invasive at first because source healing is deeper than surface relief. But what if the reason your season feels so uncomfortable is that God is no longer just managing visible problems? What if he is going after the spring itself? What if he loves you enough not to leave the hidden source untreated? This is not the deepest part yet, because after Jericho came Bethel, and Bethel exposed another reality. Not every response to God's presence is reverence. Some hearts mock what they do not honor. A group of young men came out to ridicule Elisha, mocking the prophetic mantle and treating holy things lightly. That story is sobering, not because God is fragile, but because holiness is not trivial. We live in an age that wants comfort without reverence, inspiration without surrender, encouragement without awe. But Elisha's life carried both tenderness and gravity, mercy and seriousness, compassion for the broken, but no casual treatment of what belongs to God. And this matters for your season too, because sometimes one of the reasons your soul feels dry is not that God has pulled away. It is that reverence has thinned. You still know the language. You still know the songs. But somewhere along the way, holy things became familiar in the wrong way. Your heart got flat. Your expectation got dull. Your prayer got smaller than your pain. Sometimes renewal begins when reverence returns. Then a widow came to Elisha carrying the kind of pressure that crushes people quiet. Her husband was gone. Debt remained. Her sons were at risk. She did not come with theology. She came with need, raw need, immediate need, the kind of need that makes your chest tight because you cannot see a path forward. Elisha asked her what she had in the house. She answered like many hurting people answer, "Nothing." Then she corrected herself, "Nothing, except a little oil." That tiny correction matters more than it first appears, because pain trains you to speak in absolutes. Nothing is happening. Nothing is left. Nothing will change. Nothing good can come from this. Nothing remains, and yet often, in the middle of your nothing, there's still a little oil, a little faith, a little strength, a little obedience, a little willingness, a little prayer you can barely speak, a little fragment of trust that has not died yet to you. It feels too small to mention. To God, it is enough to begin with. Elisha told her to borrow empty vessels, go inside, shut the door, and pour. There is something beautiful about that miracle happening behind a closed door. No audience, no applause, no public validation, just obedience in a hidden room. And maybe this is exactly where you are. You keep thinking the breakthrough must happen in a dramatic public moment. But some of God's most life-changing provision enters quietly. Hidden room provision, private miracle provision, door-shut grace. The kind of thing only a few people ever see, but it changes your whole future. She poured, and the oil kept flowing until every empty vessel was full. Then it stopped. Enough for the debt, enough for the future, enough for survival and beyond. That miracle says something many weary hearts need to hear. Your emptiness is not always a sign of doom. Sometimes it is an invitation for filling. The question is not whether you feel small. The question is whether you will bring God what is left. But this is where the tension deepens, because provision is not the only place people struggle to trust God. Promise is often even harder. In Shunammite, there was a woman of discernment. She recognized the presence of God on Elisha's life and made room for it. She prepared a place for him, a bed, a table, a lamp, quiet hospitality, quiet honor, quiet space for what she valued. And Elisha wanted to bless her in return. She had no son, and her husband was old. Into a long disappointed place, a promise was spoken. She would hold a son. Can you imagine what that felt like? Some promises do not awaken joy first. They awaken fear, because when hope has been buried for a long time, its resurrection can feel dangerous. You do not want to believe too quickly. You do not want to reopen that room of your heart. You do not want to let expectation rise again only to be crushed one more time. And some of you know that feeling. You are not cynical because you are rebellious. You are cautious because you have bled, but the child was born. And then, years later, the child died. This is one of the hardest turns in Elisha's story because it offends the simple version of faith. We can handle a story where God gives a promise. We struggle more with a story where the promise seems to collapse after arriving. The boy went into the field, cried out in pain, was carried back to his mother and died in her lap. There is almost no image more heartbreaking than that. A promise received, a promise loved, a promise held, and then a promise apparently lost. And that is where many viewers may be standing right now. Not in the place of never receiving, in the place of losing after receiving. You prayed for restoration, and then things broke again. You stepped into what you thought was answered prayer, and now it feels like it is dying in your hands. You let yourself hope, And now you are terrified because what once looked alive suddenly feels silent. The Shunammite woman did something extraordinary. She laid the boy in the prophet's room and went to find Elisha. She refused to let death be the final interpreter of what God had given. That is deep faith, not denial, not emotional numbness. Not pretending it does not hurt, faith, the kind that says, "This is devastating, but I am not done taking this back to God." That may be your assignment in this season, not to fake peace, not to minimize the grief, but to refuse to let the worst moment become the final meaning. Elisha came, prayed, stretched himself over the child, and life returned. Warmth came back, breath came back, movement came back. And if that part of the story touches your chest in a tender place, it is because all of us know what it is to carry something lifeless into prayer. A marriage, a dream, a calling, a desire to keep going, a piece of our own heart. This miracle does not guarantee that every earthly loss reverses the way we want it to. But it does reveal something true about God's heart. He is not indifferent to the places where grief sits in your lap. He is not cold toward the rooms where promises feel silent. He is not absent from the ache of what you thought would live. Then the story turns north to Naaman, commander of the army of Aram. Powerful, respected, victorious, decorated by human standards. But hidden beneath the uniform was leprosy. That contrast alone preaches, because people can look strong and still be falling apart in secret. And perhaps that is one reason this story keeps reaching people. So many are carrying a polished outer life and a private wound that reputation cannot heal. Naaman had status, but status did not cure him. Influence did not cleanse him. Honor did not remove the disease, and the unlikely voice that pointed him toward healing came from a captive servant girl. Never underestimate what God can place in the mouth of someone the world would ignore. Naaman came expecting a dramatic display, but Elisha did not perform for his ego. He sent a message, "Wash in the Jordan 7 times." Naaman was offended by the simplicity. That is another place where many people miss what God is doing. We want healing, but often in forms that preserve our pride. We want restoration, but without the humbling. We want cleansing, but through a process that still lets us feel impressive. Naaman almost missed his miracle because the path to it wounded his dignity. And maybe this is where some of you are stuck. The thing God is asking from you is not impossible. It is humbling. Forgive first. Apologize. Start small. Be consistent. Return to prayer quietly. Obey without being seen. Submit the wound again. Take the ordinary step you keep dismissing because it does not feel dramatic enough. Naaman finally went down into the Jordan once, twice, again and again. And on the 7th time his flesh was restored like that of a child. Notice that the water did not become special because it looked impressive. It became the place of healing because God chose obedience there. That matters for your season. Some of the holiest moments in your life will not look cinematic while they happen. They will look ordinary, repeated, almost disappointing, until one day you rise and realize something has changed. Then came one of the gentlest miracles in Elisha's life. A young prophet was cutting wood near the Jordan when the iron axe head flew off and sank into the water. He panicked because it was borrowed. It was not a national crisis. It was not a public tragedy. It was one man's small disaster. And Elisha cared. That detail is precious, because some people believe God only attends to major crises. But Elisha's ministry reveals a God who notices what embarrasses you, what inconveniences you, what seems too small to bring to prayer. The axe head was borrowed. The loss mattered. The shame mattered. The stress mattered. Elisha threw a stick into the water, and the iron floated. Iron does not float, which is exactly the point. God can raise what should have stayed sunk. God can intervene in places logic has already dismissed. God can restore small things that still carry emotional weight. Some of you have losses you keep belittling because they sound too minor compared to other people's pain. But the God of Elisha is not irritated by the small things that hurt you. He is not rolling his eyes at the quiet burden you keep carrying alone. Nothing is too small for his attention. And now the story tightens. Dothan. One morning Elisha's servant woke to find the city surrounded by horses and chariots. An enemy army had come for one man. Fear hit instantly, the kind of fear that hijacks your breathing before your mind can reason. The kind of fear many of you know all too well. A diagnosis, a message, a bill, a conversation, a threat, a collapse. An outcome you did not see coming, the servant cried out. What shall we do? Elisha answered with one of the most powerful lines in all of Scripture. Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Imagine hearing that while seeing only enemy forces. That is what makes the statement so strong. Faith is not pretending the army is not there. Faith is seeing that the army is not the whole story. Elisha prayed for the servant's eyes to be opened, and suddenly the mountains were full of horses and chariots of fire. Heaven's protection had been there the whole time, invisible, but real, unseen. But not absent. That may be the word someone needs today more than anything else. The fact that you cannot see what God is doing does not mean He is doing nothing. The fact that you feel surrounded does not mean you are abandoned. The fact that fear is loud does not make fear correct. There are realities in the spirit that your panic cannot measure. Then Elisha prayed again, and the enemy was struck with blindness. He led them to Samaria, where the king of Israel asked if he should kill them. Elisha said no. Feed them, give them water, send them home. Mercy after threat, restraint after power, compassion where retaliation would have looked easier. This is another reason Elisha's life matters. The power of God on his life did not make him harsher. It made him more aligned with God's heart. Strength and mercy met in the same vessel, and that is a challenge for anyone who has been wounded. Pain can make you hungry for vindication, but when God truly forms a person, He does not just make them powerful. He makes them clean in how they carry power. Years passed. Elisha grew old. The prophet who once crossed the Jordan behind Elijah now lay sick in bed. Time had done what time does. Seasons changed, bodies weakened. Ministries that once moved across cities slowed down. And this is where another misunderstanding must break. Aging is not proof that God has left. Weakness is not proof that usefulness has ended. The quieting of one season does not mean the end of divine purpose. Elisha's body weakened, but the presence of God on his life had not been shallow or temporary. It had soaked into the very story of who he was. Kings still came. Influence remained. Heaven's imprint had gone deeper than visible activity. Then Elisha died. This is where human logic wants to close the book. The prophet is gone. The miracles are over. The story is complete. But heaven was not finished speaking later, during a hurried burial, interrupted by Moabite raiders. Some men threw a dead body into Elisha's tomb. The corpse touched the prophet's bones, and the man came back to life. Let that image sit with you. No sermon, no music, no public gathering. No prayer spoken in the moment, just bones. Bones touched by a life that had walked so closely with God that even after visible activity ended, testimony remained. This is not about glorifying Elisha as if he were the source. It is about the God who leaves residue, the God whose work in a yielded life is so deep that death itself does not erase the witness. And here is the reveal many weary hearts need. God's deepest work in you may not be the visible moments everyone notices. It may be the hidden formation that leaves holy residue long after the season itself seems over. The world celebrates performance. God often treasures presence. The world asks what you produced. God asks what you carried. The world notices the public miracle. God sees the private surrender that made the life able to carry his presence at all. Elisha's bones preach a sermon to every person who thinks their hidden season is meaningless. No hidden obedience is wasted. No unseen faithfulness is wasted. No tear cried before God is wasted. No season of serving without applause is wasted. No prayer whispered through exhaustion is wasted. No surrender made in obscurity is wasted. Because God is doing more than arranging outcomes. He is shaping the vessel. God is doing more than arranging out. And if you only measure your life by visible breakthroughs, you may completely miss the deepest work he is doing in you. This is where most people lose heart, not always at the beginning of pain, often in the middle of silence, in the stretch where nothing seems to confirm that your faithfulness matters, in the hallway where the old season has closed and the new one has not opened, in the room where prayer feels repetitive, in the quiet where other people's testimonies seem louder than your own, in the hidden place where you start asking whether your name has gone quiet in heaven. But what if heaven's silence is not neglect? What if it is depth? What if God is not withholding because he is cruel, but slowing because what he is building in you cannot be rushed without being weakened? What if some doors closed not because you were rejected, but because mercy arrived before the breakthrough did? What if the waiting is not wasted? What if the very thing exhausting you is the place where your roots are going deepest? A seed buried underground can feel forgotten if all it knows is darkness. But buried is not abandoned. Buried is often becoming. Pruning can feel like loss if all you can see is what was cut. But pruning is not hatred. It is preparation for fruit you cannot carry in your current shape. Bones healing can be painful because rebuilding often is. But pain does not always mean something is going wrong. Sometimes it means something broken is being set back into place. And this changes the meaning of your whole season, because if you keep reading delay as rejection, you will grow bitter in a place where God meant to deepen you. If you keep reading silence as absence, you may leave the room where God is quietly rebuilding your inner life. If you keep reading hiddenness as failure, you may envy people who are visible while missing the holy work God is doing in your roots. Elisha's life tells a different story. The field mattered, the serving mattered, the staying mattered, the asking mattered, the striking of the Jordan mattered, the healing of Jericho mattered, the widow's oil mattered, the Shunammite's grief mattered, Naaman's humbling mattered, the floating axe head mattered, Dothan mattered, the deathbed mattered, even the bones mattered. Why? Because all of it was part of one larger witness. God is faithful in every kind of season, faithful in ordinary beginnings, faithful in long preparation, faithful in painful transitions, faithful in healing what is bitter, faithful in hidden provision, faithful in the room of grief, faithful in the humbling process, faithful in small losses, faithful when fear surrounds, faithful when the body weakens, faithful even when a story seems over. And maybe that is what your heart has been aching to hear. Not a shallow slogan, not a borrowed phrase, not another polished encouragement that does not touch the real fatigue. But this: you are not forgotten in your hidden season. The silence is not proof that God left. The slowness is not proof that he changed his mind. The closed door is not always rejection. The pain is not always punishment. The quiet is not always emptiness. Sometimes God is doing his deepest work where your eyes have the least to measure. That does not make the season easy. It makes it meaningful, and meaning changes endurance, because when pain feels meaningless, people quit. When waiting feels empty, people harden. When silence feels personal, people withdraw. But when God reframes the season, strength begins to return. Not because all the questions vanish, but because the soul stops interpreting everything through fear. So what do you do if you are in that kind of season right now? You do what Elisha did. You stay close, you keep walking, you bring God what is left. You let him touch the source, not just the symptoms. You make room for his presence. You humble yourself in the ordinary step. You bring him the small burden too. You ask him to open your eyes when fear gets loud. You refuse to let death write the final meaning over what God has spoken. And you trust that what he is building in secret is not less real because it is unseen. There are some of you listening right now who have become afraid of hoping again. You have been disappointed enough times that numbness now feels safer than faith. I understand that, but numbness may protect you from disappointment while also blocking your ability to recognize the gentle movements of God. Sometimes healing does not begin when all pain disappears. Sometimes healing begins when you let yourself believe that silence might not mean what fear said it meant. There are others of you who are angry at the delay, angry at the loss, angry at the way the story has unfolded, angry because you did obey, and still the road got hard. That anger does not scare God, but do not let anger become your interpreter. Bring it to him, yes. Speak honestly, yes, but do not build your theology on the loudest moment of your pain. Your worst day does not always tell the truth about God. And some of you are simply tired, not rebellious, not dramatic, just tired of being strong, tired of trying to explain your faith to people who do not understand the cost of waiting, tired of smiling when inside you feel like a room with the lights turned low, tired of hoping carefully because hope has felt expensive. If that is you, then maybe let Elisha's story rest on your life for a moment like that first mantle did in the field. Not as pressure, as invitation. God still sees people in fields. God still forms people in hidden seasons. God still parts rivers after painful transitions. God still heals bitter springs. God still multiplies what looks small. God still visits rooms of grief. God still humbles pride to restore the heart. God still cares about sunken things. God still surrounds his people with unseen help. God still leaves life where the world expects only endings. And if he is that kind of God, then your season may hold more holy meaning than you can presently see. So maybe the silence was never proof that God had left. Maybe it was proof that he was doing something too deep to rush. Maybe the waiting was not empty. Maybe the hidden room was holy. Maybe the bitter place is where he is touching the source. Maybe the loss has not finished speaking because God has not spoken his final word yet. Maybe what feels buried is still becoming. Maybe what looks delayed is being strengthened. Maybe what seems closed is actually being protected. Maybe what feels like the end of the story is only the end of your ability to control it. And maybe that is where trust finally becomes real. Not when everything makes sense, but when you decide that God is still good in the room, where explanation has not arrived. Elisha's life is not merely a record of wonders. It is a call to stay, a call to trust, a call to let hidden seasons shape you instead of embitter you, a call to reverence, a call to obedience in ordinary things, a call to carry God's presence more seriously than your public image, a call to believe that heaven is active even when your eyes are tired, a call to keep walking long enough to see what the silence was protecting. So before this message ends, let me say to the exhausted heart, the disappointed heart, the fearful heart, the hidden heart. You are not behind. You are not invisible. You are not abandoned. And this season is not empty. The story is not over where it went quiet. Stay with God here. Stay long enough to let Him heal the source. Stay long enough to let Him reshape your reading of this season. Stay long enough to discover that what felt like stillness may have been formation. Stay long enough to see that the God who worked through Elisha still knows how to breathe life into places that look finished. And if all you have tonight is a little oil, bring it. If all you have is one tired prayer, pray it. If all you have is enough strength to say, Lord, do not let me misread this season, then say that. That is enough to begin, because God has always known how to start with little. He has always known how to work in hidden rooms. He has always known how to surprise tombs. And He has not forgotten your name, if this message met you in a place you have not been able to explain. Let that be your reminder that God still knows how to find you there. And if you have been in a long waiting season, do not leave too early. Do not walk away from the room just because it went quiet. There may still be life in what looks buried. There may still be mercy in what feels delayed. There may still be holy purpose in what feels hidden. And tonight, may the God of Elisha meet you in your field, your Jordan, your closed door, your bitter spring, your silent room, your Dothan, and even your place of buried hope. May He open your eyes where fear has narrowed them. May He heal what has grown bitter at the source. May He multiply what feels too small. May He breathe on the places that seem finished. May He keep your heart soft in the waiting. May He teach you to trust what He is doing in secret. And may you discover, even here, that the silence was never the end of the story.